Over the next few weeks, I am going to preach several sermons taken from the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. 1st and 2nd Samuel tell a wonderful story of God's dealings with the people of Israel. They tell some of the stories that are very familiar to us, like David and Goliath and many others. But the vast majority of the book, I think, is really unknown. And certainly the flow of the story is relatively unknown amongst us in the church. And so today is something of a preliminary sermon. It's a way to get the story out there, a way to hopefully draw you in to the beginning of the story. So you will find it more connections to it. So you will find it more engaging in your lives. If this sermon really works well, what I hope will happen is that you will go home and in the next week read all of 1st and 2nd Samuel from the Old Testament. So if anybody does that, tell me next week so I know whether this worked. So I'm going to begin today with one line of Scripture. This is the passage, this is the last verse of the book of Judges. The book of Judges comes just before 1st and 2nd Samuel. Actually, Ruth is thrown in there in between, but Ruth doesn't have anything to do with the other books. So it's the last line of the book of Judges. And then we're going to talk during the sermon today about how the story of 1st Samuel unfolds. So this is the end of the book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. The word of God for the people of God. Okay, so this is going to be a little unusual today. I warned the people in the balcony earlier. Bruce, you weren't here yet, but I warned the people in the balcony that I'm going to come down here and talk. Looking ahead to this Sunday, I figured this might be a little bit of a low-energy Sunday, the middle of the summer. It's been hot. It's really humid. Not the greatest crowd here on Sunday morning. So I wanted to make it a little interactive, to draw you into this a little bit. And I just read that last line of the book of Judges. And I wonder if someone can tell me something that happened before that in the Bible. Anything that happened before that in the Bible. And I'm going to deal with uncomfortable silence because I know you know the answer to this one. Yep, God made the world. Good. Exodus happened, that's correct. Anything else? Those two big ones. Cain slew Abel, that is correct. What was that? All the laws of Leviticus, that's right. The most boring book in the Bible. All right, what else happened? Jericho fell. Under who was the main leader when Jericho fell? Yes, Joshua, exactly. Paul knows because there's a nice song about it. Yes, Joshua died before Judges. Joshua goes into the promised land and dies not too terribly long after. Okay, so all right, you're getting some of the big highlights. Yeah, God created the world, Noah and the flood. We skipped over Abraham. God calls Abraham. It's the beginning of God's dealing with the people of Israel. That's who the Israelites are. They are the descendants of Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Then Jacob's son is Joseph of the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat fame. Joseph is the one who leads the people down into Egypt. People are enslaved. They are in slavery for 400 years. Then this that somebody mentions, and the people are delivered from slavery in Egypt. They go up, Moses goes up on the receive the 10 Commandments, comes down, finds them doing what? Yep, worshiping the gold. busts the ark, busts the tablet, the 10 Commandments on the calf, destroys it. They create the ark to carry the remnants. God makes new 10 Commandments, new tablets for the 10 Commandments, put them in the ark. The ark leads them through the wilderness. They wander for 40 years in punishment for their sin. And at the end of this 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, they get up to the east side of the river Jordan, and they're about to cross over into the promised land. Moses dies because of wandering in the wilderness, and Joshua takes over leadership. They cross over into the Holy Land, into the promised land, and then begins basically the time of the book of Judges. And the book of Judges is actually a little bit confusing because it tells two different stories about how the promised land is settled by the Israelites. In one version of the story is kind of what Paul mentioned, John mentioned Jericho, and Paul mentioned Joshua. Joshua and the armies of the Lord come crashing into these cities and destroy them, and they take property, and they take land, and they take cities, and they appear to be all triumphant, and everything seems to be going wonderfully. But then there's another way of telling the story. If you read between the lines, you can see that the people of Israel actually more often settle where there aren't any other, so they don't have to take any land. They don't have to fight any battles. They settle in the hill country. People hadn't figured out yet how to work agriculture up in the hills. It was hard to plow the soil and move the rocks and grow crops on an incline. And so they go into the hill country and they settle there. And they find ways to get along with the people who are already there. So it says in the Bible, so the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And they took their daughters as wives for themselves, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they worshiped their gods. Now, how were the Israelites led during this time? Yeah, the judges. I suspect that some of you might not know too much about the judges. These are not judges like, people in black robes sitting at the front of a court of law. These are really charismatic military leaders. People who, by their own, not necessarily even God-appointed position, take over the leadership of the people. Yes, they do some judging, a little bit like we would think of judging now, where they decide disputes among the people. But primarily they're military leaders who have the charisma to lead the people and lead them out in what are really local skirmishes. People like, I'm sure you all have the judges memorized though, right? Everybody know who all the judges are? Or at least give me the 6 top ones, right? Deborah, Samson, got 2. Othniel? Come on, you don't know Othniel? No, not oatmeal. Othniel. Ehud. Very good, Nancy. All right, those are the only 4 I remember too. Jephthah and Gideon. Can't forget old Gideon. Yeah, those are the main judges, and they lead the people of God. So, how do you think this judges thing was working for Israel? How'd the whole thing work out? The Israelites were evil. The Israelites were evil. Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. In what ways were they evil? They forgot the Lord their God and they worshiped Baal. Baal is the god of the Canaanites. They're enemies, the foreigners. And you notice even in the line perhaps, or in this passage that I read earlier, They took their daughters as wives for themselves, and their own daughters they gave to the sons of the foreigners, and they worshiped their gods. So yeah, this time of the judges didn't really work out so well. Actually, I guess you could say it was working fine for most of them. They seemed to be getting along just fine. They were adjusting to this new land where they found themselves. They were assimilating with the people who were already there. Assimilating always seems like a good idea. That's certainly what we want people to do when they come into American culture, right? They're fit neighbors. But of course, that wasn't what Israel was really about. It's not what Israel was supposed to do. God didn't deliver the people from slavery in Egypt. God didn't give them the Ten Commandments and teach them the way of God so that they could go up into the promised land and forget about it all. They're not supposed to be like the people all around them. And they were supposed instead to be a blessing to those people, not to be like those people, but to be a blessing to those people by showing them the way of God in the world. As the line that I read earlier, the last line of the book of Judges puts it, dripping with irony. In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. That's not good in the Bible. So, right there at that point begins the story of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And again, I really do hope that you'll go home and read 1st and 2nd Samuel in the next week. They're great books in the Bible, great stories in here. Personal, political, power battles, lots of blood and gore for those of you who like that kind of thing. So the book begins, as the book of 1 Samuel begins, we hear of Eli. Eli is a priest who oversees sacrifices in the temple in a town called Shiloh, which is one of the places where the Israelites offered sacrifices to God before the temple in Jerusalem was built. Eli was a decent enough guy, a good guy. He was a respected leader. He was honest. But Eli had a downfall. Does anybody remember Eli's downfall? It's perfect for today, right? He was a really bad father. He had 2 sons, one named Hophni, one named Phinehas, which right there tells you that something's wrong because these are Egyptian names. So here's the guy, and he names his son after Egyptian folks, after Egyptian gods perhaps, rather than after a nice proper Israelite name. So you know right from the start that he's off on a bad track with the names of his sons. And his sons are just, okay, what's the worst word I can use for somebody in church? Huh? Reprobate, stinkers? Okay. Maybe something a little stronger than stinkers. Sinners, yes, sinners is good. Despicable, I like that. I don't know how old this word is. You guys recognize the word scofflaws? How do you say it? Scofflaws. Scoffing the laws. Yeah, they're like that. They're just despicable, miserable wretches. And the people don't like them because they take bribes. They like judge the people, but they take bribes. And then they also, the people would come to offer their sacrifices to God. And the whole point of a sacrifice to God is that you're supposed to burn off the fat from the animal sacrifice. And the fat goes up as a wonderful offering, fragrance to God. But what these guys would do is they'd make everybody cut off the fat first and then give them the meat so that they could benefit from the sacrifice. People just were not real happy about this kind of thing. So Eli is basically a leader among the people, but he has terrible kids and he can't handle them. And then we also hear about Hannah here at the beginning of 1 Samuel. We hear about this woman who's suffering the greatest misfortune that a woman can suffer in that culture, which is not being able to have children. So she prays and prays, and she tells God that if God gives her a child, then she will commit that child to a lifetime of service and devotion to God. She tells Eli, listen, if you give me a child, I'm going to commit my firstborn son to work with you in the service of God in the temple in Shiloh. And so that's exactly what happens, and her son is born, Samuel. That's where the books get their name, of course. Samuel is born, and she raises him as a very young child. When he's just a few years old, she sends him off to the Shiloh temple so that he can serve God. Okay, and at one point then, the people are being led by Samuel, and God, let me see, where do I got to pick up here? Still, though, even under Samuel, who grows in favor and blessing by God, things aren't going too well with Samuel. No one remembers Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. No one remembers Moses and the Exodus and all that other stuff that we talked about. And they all continue to do, as the line says, what is right in their own eyes. And God then, at this point, for God's part, says, fine. And God stops helping the Israelites. It's kind of like God says, I've had enough. Forget it. But then at one point, they go out in battle against the Philistines. And the Israelites, they're no dummies. They try to use the power of God whenever they can. And so they take the Ark of the Covenant, take it out to battle with them, and they hold it up. And it's kind of like just by holding the Ark of the Covenant on the rods before the people of the Philistines, it's like, ooh, the Philistines are going to run away and cry because they have the Ark of the Lord. But although this had often worked in the past in their battles, it doesn't work this time. The Ark of the Covenant has no effect. The people get slaughtered by the Philistines. Thousands are killed in a single day. The Philistines, as a matter of fact, capture the Ark of God, and the Ark of God then goes off into the Philistine camp. It doesn't go so well for the Philistines. Everywhere the Ark of God goes, it's kind of like a plague begins in the town or the village, and so the Philistines send the Ark of the Covenant back to the people. And then something really important happens in the story. Do you have any guesses? I hear some mumblings. The people demand something from God. Actually, from Samuel. The people demand something from Samuel. Yes, a king. The people go to Samuel and say, Samuel, we want a king. And Samuel, of course, maybe you've heard me say this before in sermons. Samuel says, you have a king. God is your king. And the people say, no, we want a real king. We want a king we can see, a king who can lead us into battle so we can be like our neighbors. We can be powerful and strong and rule other peoples. And Samuel says, no, you really don't want a king like that because God is your king. And the people say, yeah, we want a king. There's this great passage. I got to read the whole thing to you. So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. Samuel, speaking the word of God, says to the people, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. And what do the people say? Yeah! That's what we want. Give us a king like that. Sure, sounds good. And God says, all right, I'll give you a king. And so let's dwell in that biblical moment for a minute. I mean, what's really going on here? This story is told about the history of Israel and this whole thing about people asking for a king. I mean, what's really going on here? What's motivating these people to ask for a king? They lost their faith. Why? What caused them to lose their faith? Sally, were we going to say something? 18? They didn't get what did they want? Yeah, they wanted order, something to take over the chaos around them. What else? What else is driving them? Yeah, exactly, power against their enemies. And what is that desire for power in all humans basically based in? Yeah. You know, think about, they're fearful. They fear their enemies. They fear what's going to happen to them. You know, I mentioned that there are all sorts of battles and fights and you know, worshiping of other gods and giving your sons and daughters to other people in marriage and mixing with the people, and yet the violence never stops. And these people fear for their lives and for their well-being and for their future. And so they cry out for that power to be able to go up against their enemies. So, in what way are they grieving? Most powerful action in human life, not much powerful action in human life, is motivated by grieving something. What are they grieving? They want to know God. Yeah, certainly in some ways. They probably don't know that. They probably wouldn't say it that way themselves, but yeah, you could say they want to know God. Yeah, there you go. They want the good old days. They want, like, wow, God used to, like, take care of us. God led us out of slavery in Egypt, but where's God now? God seems to have abandoned them, so they want this king. All right. What are these people suffering? What are they suffering? Yeah. Yeah, a lack of direction, exactly. Lack of direction politically, lack of direction what we would kind of call religiously. lack of direction as far as just like care about the future goes. They're also suffering just loss, right? I mean, just loss of control, loss of direction, like Sally said, loss of identity. Of course, what does a king give you? A king gives you identity. I mean, look at the British Empire to this day, has a queen, actually, but even though the queen is completely pointless for the functioning of the British Commonwealth, it still provides a sense of identity, even 400 years after the monarchy has had no power. They wanted identity. They lost identity. Now, why doesn't God want them to have a human king? Because God's the king. Right? Yeah. Holly said because they'd basically be worshiping this king, sense. I mean, whether or not the king claims to be a god, I mean, certainly the king fulfills that role to some degree. It's a very easy, visible thing to latch onto, to give you your identity, to follow and obey, which is exactly what we're all supposed to do with God, right? So yeah, God, the king, in a sense, takes the place of God. God is their king, and yet can't be seen, and they want something they can see. So now, can you see yourself in this story as it's unfolding so far? It's by no means the end of the story. Can you see yourself in this story at all? This is that point in the sermon where I like to hope, if I was doing this in a more traditional way, me speaking without interaction, that you'd be kind of letting your mind wander a little bit inside yourself when that sermon really becomes a two-way conversation in a sense, perhaps quietly, silently on your part, but a two-way conversation with what's going on your brain. Can you see yourself in this story at all? Yeah? Any ways? How do you see yourself in this story? We all want to be safe. Yeah. Safety is such a big driving motivator in this whole story. And in our lives as well. What else? What about the whole assimilation thing? We like to kind of fit in with the people around us, right? It sort of relieves that uncomfortable tension, anxiety about being different. I mean, don't we all have kind of a remnant of that teenager in us? No offense to teenagers present, you guys are older. Are you still 19? All right, 2 teenagers. Sorry. Oh, there's one. No, she's 12. Are you 13 yet? Almost. All right. So we got almost not teenagers and almost 2 teenagers. But that kind of teenager sense, you just want to fit in. You wear the same clothes as everybody else. You talk like everybody else. You try to do the same stuff as everybody else, so you fit in. We all kind of still have a little bit. I mean, maybe not in the clothes and the way of talking and everything, but the way we live our lives, we still have that little bit of that. We want to assimilate. We want to be part of those around us. And we too, I think, have trouble seeing God's way forward. I mean, isn't that what's going on here? God is clearly, here at work in this story, and yet the people don't see it. The people don't see God as active in their lives. They don't see God's way forward, and so they create their own way forward. I mean, isn't that kind of what we do? We kind of like fail to see what in the world God is up to in our lives, and so we direct and lead, we direct and provide our own identity and our own way forward. And then there's this sense of justice. I don't know. I mean, think of the world today. Don't we see justice as something that comes from above, something that is imposed upon us, rather than kind of as a holistic environment that grows up from the goodness and well-being of regular people? I mean, I guess another way to say this is just, don't we lack patience? We all know that God has kind of laid out a path in the world, the way of love. I'll just be simple about it for the purposes today, but the way of love, the way of the cross, and yet we don't have the patience to kind of see that through to the end. And so we create our own justice from above. We think that we can impose it upon others. But you know what's really, I guess, deeply moving about this story? The thing that really just kind of, when you read through it, and again, I hope you'll read through it when you go home sometime this week. The thing is that God is the main character in this story throughout the whole thing. God is the main actor in this story. This is our people, in many ways, at their absolute worst. Everyone does what is right in their own eyes. But God still finds a way to be present, to be at work among them. And I think that can give us some hope. We don't often see what the heck God is doing in our midst, but with this story of 1 Samuel as part of who we are, as part of our story, we can see that God is there. God is alive and present and active. God is there throughout this story, and God is present throughout our stories as well, whether we see it or not. So go home, read 1 and 2 Samuel, slowly delve into the story. Let it shape who you are at a human level. It will make you more a person of God. Amen.